Welcome to Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Joining me is senior managing editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
Before we start, we remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcasts, our complete newsletter, and all our religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. Now for today's episode. Even in the 19th century, Brigham Young Academy, later Brigham Young University, welcomed students of both sexes, all nationalities, religions, races, and colors. Nearly from the start, it included women, which made it distinctive among other American higher education institutions. And the school, owned and operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, had a small but consistent non-white student population. That included the school's first Black graduate, Norman Wilson, who was not a Latter-day Saint, who earned his degree in 1939. Grace Ann Soelberg curated a BYU exhibit honoring Wilson. She also looked at how Black students were treated at the school and how they were depicted in its yearbooks from 1911 to 1985. Soelberg, now a graduate student at the University of Utah, joins us in the studio to talk about her findings. Grace, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
So give us a little background on yourself. Where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I born and raised in Utah. I grew up in Kaysville. Yeah, lived in Davis County pretty much my whole life.
And did you identify with the Black BYU students back in the day, living in a mostly white community? I don't know how many people of color live in Utah, in Kaysville.
Yeah, not very many. Yeah, I mean, growing up, I was me, my brother, and like the 2-3 other families that maybe would have had like Black adopted kids is kind of all there was. So going to BYU was different because I did feel different from Black students who had come from like actual Black homes and from Black spaces. And so I do feel like there was a little bit of a disconnect there.
So tell us a little bit about that experience at BYU for you.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, it was what I expected because it's what I've lived in my whole life as being, I was raised in the Mormon church and then going to BYU. That wasn't any different. And being around primarily white people was not any different for me. And so if anything, like seeing other Black students struggle was, it was something that I had already dealt with and been dealing with for a long time. And so our struggles were just different.
Did you have any, growing up or at BYU, did you have any incidents of racial incidents where people said stuff?
Like maybe even microaggressions, things like that.
Sure. Yeah. Micro, macro, all in between.
They run the gambit.
Yeah. I mean, I had to move apartment complexes because of things that were happening one year. So. Mm-hmm.
So let's jump into some of your research. Okay. Mm-hmm. Why did you decide to analyze the yearbooks and what did you find?
Yeah, so it actually came because of how I found out about the first Black student, but I was looking through the yearbooks and I found his photo and was like, oh my goodness, why does nobody know about this person? And so from there, I needed a topic for my honors thesis research. And so I was like, what else can I find in these yearbooks? What else is there in regard to race? So I just decided to look through all of them.
So what kind of racial hierarchy did you discover in your study?
Yeah, I don't know. Outside of like white supremacy, I guess I wouldn't say that there's like a hierarchy. It's just 3 distinct ways that white students or like the yearbook portray different racial groups. And so I looked primarily at, like Indigenous students, Asian students broadly, and then Black students. And for Black students, it was kind of used as a way to be like, we're not racist, we're so awesome. Versus like Indigenous students were very much so categorized as like Lamanites. And it was very like this racial theology was placed upon them. And then for Asian students, whether they were Asian American or there was, students from Japan or particularly a lot of Japanese students from Hawaii, were kind of allowed a little bit more freedom in the way that they were viewed because they were like fantasized and orientalized. And so people wanted to know more about their cultures and where they were from. And so they were allowed a little bit more of that freedom to say who they were because there's not like right, that race theology to place upon Asian students like there is for Black students or for Indigenous students. They had some more breathing room, I guess, but it still wasn't great, right? It's still Orientalism. But there was a little bit more movement there.
But they were still not perceived as, quote, white.
No.
They were still other.
Yes. Yeah.
Just not as badly other.
Yeah. It was like a fascinating other in a way.
Mm-hmm. The racial theology you talk about, you're talking about kind of in Mormon culture. There are some things that, like you talk about Lamanite in Book of Mormon, which may not be maybe a misnomer to use that, but nonetheless, that's what you're referring to.
Yes.
And obviously the church's, past racist policy, of course, would come into play.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to quote from your honors thesis about this. In the Banyan, which is the BYU yearbook, white students purposely crafted a narrative of a white dominant and white serving institution, with non-white students serving as ornaments of fascination and props used in public relations to defend the school, LDS Church, and white students themselves from accusations of racism and bigotry. So let's, you got into it just a little bit, but what did you mean by ornaments of fascination?
Yeah, that's mainly in relation to like the Asian students, particularly those that were international students. There'd be lots of photos of them posing, like maybe in more like traditional clothes, or particularly there was a lot of like dances that were like what they would say were Oriental themed, right? And so it was like, nights in Japan, or like these very racialized events. And so it was seen as something that was fascinating and unique, which is not unique to BYU or Utah in any way. That's, a very Western and American phenomenon. But yeah, seeing them as these interesting creatures almost to be ogled and like looked at in that way.
So how did the Black students protect the school from accusations of racism and bigotry?
Yeah, I think it's the way that the yearbook framed things, particularly during, the protest of BYU Athletics in the late 60s. There's several instances where if the yearbook touches on that at all, I feel very purposeful in the way that they're talking about it. So they have, for one, this picture of people, I believe it's at Lavelle Edwards Stadium, that are holding up like these placards that like, a lot of people together, like making like a big picture, right? And it's like this black and this white hand, like holding hands. And so that doesn't really capture like what was going on at the time. Or there was a Black-led study from the University of Arizona who came to BYU and during that time to kind of do an investigation of sorts into the racism on campus. And in the yearbook, they reported, these Black researchers found that BYU is, I think it's literally like, quote, no more or less racist than other schools. But then right next to that picture in the yearbook is a picture of protesters at one of, outside of, I think, a BYU basketball game, actually. And it says, nobody was really paying these protesters' mind. And so I think it's very intentful to put a picture of a Black person and quote him as saying, BYU is not that racist next to this picture of protesters and being like, they, didn't really mean anything. Nobody really listened to them. It was a small group of people. Or like one of the first Black football players, like having pictures of him with the team playing games and things like that. Like it just doesn't capture truly what was happening at that time, particularly for BYU football, but also just BYU athletics in general.
Did the yearbooks touch upon, for instance, the Wyoming Black 14? Did it even talk about that at all?
No.
That's the famous one where 14 Wyoming players,
protested.
Just for listeners who may not know, were going to wear armbands to protest the church's policy at that time, preventing Black men and women from priesthood and temple. And they were kicked off the team by the Wyoming coach. Now the church has embraced the people of the Black 14, so the surviving members.
So I guess the message was, yeah, we have Black students here and they're happy.
Yeah. And, we're
we
trying
have Black friends.
we're champions of racial diversity. Look at us, holding up these placards, we're all about love and unity. And, it's very intentional the way that they're framing these things. And so that's kind of what I was using or even in when Robert Stevenson was the first student body vice president who was Black in the 70s. And there was like a New York Times article written about it. And, he talks about how, people at BYU treat me just like anybody else and things. But BYU really promoted that image and like, look, we have a Black vice president, right? And so, kind of purposely framing these students. And that's not to disregard how they actually felt. But I do think that the way that they're framed, at least in my research in the yearbook, it's pretty interesting.
Did you find blackface?
Yes. Lots of
We
it.
do know you did, so that's why we want to talk about that. First of all, how do you define blackface?
Yeah, I think blackface is particularly, right, a performance style of people, right, darkening their faces. And that can be just even, for example, like there's performances of Othello in the yearbook where someone is not doing what you typically think of as blackface, but is still darkening their skin to, the very stereotypical minstrel with big lips, big eyes, that jet black face paint. So I think there's a range, but it's typically, done for performance reasons, comedy, singing, things like that.
Did you ever find evidence of like just being done at parties and dances and things like that? Yeah.
Yes, there's lots of pictures of, junior prom, things like that, where people, or like Halloween dances where they're pictured in blackface, or even it'll be mentioned in the caption of the photo. Like it'll talk about the dance and be like people dressed up as blank, 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 blank. And one of them was like darkies was how they put it. And so, yeah, even if it's not pictured, it's still mentioned as something that's happening.
Do you know how common it was at BYU then? I mean, can you gauge from that, or did your research show that? Was it?
Yeah, I mean, so the yearbooks run from 1911 to 1985. And the first picture that I found was in 1914. And then up until 1985. So,
wow.
And that was the 85 one was an Othello performance. So I do think that it's still not great, but it is slightly different in terms of like what we typically think of blackface minstrelsy as being. I would say it's most prominent in like the 50s was when I found a lot. The 30s as well, more so like in plays. There's a lot of that. And even back when BYU had a high school and an elementary school even, in those early yearbooks, there's like young students and high school students doing it as well.
Yeah.
So.
Do you have any idea whether BYU was more often or less often? I'm not sure if you can answer that or not.
Than other schools?
Yeah. In that time frame.
I mean, I would feel like it's just pretty typical. Like it's not more or less than other places, but maybe not what you would hope.
And productions at church.
Yep.
Yes. Theatrical productions at church included blackface.
Yes. So there was a BYU, I believe the article that I found was from 1956, but this group, a minstrel troupe from BYU who would travel to different, K through 12 schools throughout the valley, but also like wards and state conferences and things like that, and would do blackface performances. So that was like a BYU actual like student performing group. But then also, and this is something that, Dr. Reeve has found too, is that many wards would host fundraisers to support the building of new ward houses, stake buildings, or to fund missionaries by having like talent shows and things like that would often include minstrel shows. So these were literally funding church buildings and missionaries.
I mean, I think today most people know that blackface is very damning and damaging. But at the time, what do you think the damage was to have all of these in the yearbooks?
I think it's just a very direct, indication of how they were feeling about themselves. I mean, that's what I would argue is that blackface has a lot more to do with whiteness than it does about Black people, because it's not supposed to actually depict Black people. It's supposed to depict, right, a racist stereotype. And so I think by putting it on, you're almost indicating what you are not, right? You're like, I am not this. And so I'm performing this. It's something that I can take off. And so I think it said a lot more about their own white identity. I think finally feeling comfortable in a white identity, Mormons kind of having this interesting history of their relationship to the US government, but also their relationship to whiteness. And I feel like, especially mid 20th century, they're finally comfortable being American and being white. And that's one way that they can show that.
And it kind of reflects what you're saying earlier about the othering of Black students and people of color. And also the racial hierarchy, like we're white, we're not these people. We're going to stereotype them. We're going to pretend, like you say, performative, but also seriously othering and hierarchy. Seemed to me those messages. So let's move to a happier topic.
Okay.
Norman Wilson.
Yeah.
Tell us, most people would have thought the first Black graduate would have been in the 60s, right?
Yeah.
So this was a surprise to you.
Yeah, right. When I found him in those yearbooks, I was really shocked. And at first I thought it was like a printing error because sometimes there are students, back then, right? The printing is not always perfect, but
not just back then. Yeah.
Still today, so I thought, okay, maybe this is an error, but I just looked closer at it. And I'm like, no, this is a Black man. And
1939 to reinforce.
Yeah, when he graduated.
Yeah. So he went to BYU from 1937 to 1939 as a master's student, actually. And so I started doing more research into Black students at BYU. And so people had known that the first African-American to go to BYU was Darius Gray, or at least at the time, that's what people thought. But the first Black students before anyone knew about Norman Wilson, people did know that there was some like Nigerian students who came in the 50s, who I don't believe ever graduated, but they came on like a special program that BYU had that like abruptly ended. And it's very hard to find documentation as to why. A lot of that has been redacted. But yeah, so before then, that's kind of all people knew is there was these mysterious students in like the 50s, and then there was Darius. So finding out about Norman coming, at least 10 years before even these Nigerian students was huge.
So tell us, how did he get to BYU and what happened to him when he arrived in Provo?
Yeah, so it's kind of a crazy story. And the information that I have about this is largely secondhand information. But from what I have been told is that he was listening to a radio broadcast one day, and, he's not LDS. He grew up in Louisiana, and he heard a BYU football score and like felt really impressed by hearing about this school. And so he decided to like look into it and wrote to BYU like admissions office. And they said, oh, you just kind of need to come in person and we'll see. And so he made his way from Louisiana to Provo. It was a very difficult journey. He kind of like hoboed and hitchhiked on trains, had to walk through like outside of cities and be very careful where he was, right? Especially like moving through the South, to like avoid like lynchings and sundown towns and things like that. When he got to Provo, he, got off the train. I think however he was able to get here, he went through Ogden and then down through Provo is how he was able to get on the train line. But when he got off, a white police officer approached him and was like, why are you here? And he told him, I'm trying to become a BYU student, and he didn't believe him. And so he told him like, you can't, like, there's nowhere for you to stay in this town. Like, we don't allow like Black people here pretty much. And you can't like sleep in the street. So for tonight, until you leave, you can like stay at the jailhouse. So he wasn't arrested, but that was the only place he was allowed to be. And so he went to the jailhouse, and then the next morning went up to BYU administration and got in.
And didn't have to live in the jailhouse anymore.
No.
We were thinking, okay.
Yes. So
good to know at least.
How did he find housing though?
Yeah. So it's so when he went up to the administration, he talked directly to President Harris. At the time, if only it worked like that nowadays. But so he went directly to President Harris, and it's unclear exactly what happened in that meeting. But by the end of it, they had given him like a scholarship for tuition, and they worked out with the owner of, it's called the Hotel Roberts, that used to be on University Avenue. I believe it's not there anymore. But the owners let him stay there for free as long as he would like kind of do some work for them on the weekends and things. So, but they had to go out of their way to arrange that because there wasn't.
And you said he had a wife. He was married.
Yes.
And that's why they weren't so worried about him dating the white students, right?
That's what I think. He and his wife was not with him in Provo. She stayed back in New Orleans. But she did come to Provo once he graduated and helped him type his thesis, actually. But she was not there the majority of the time. And so I do think that quelmed some fears of, because the LDS Church is very afraid of interracial dating, especially at this time with Black men in particular.
Yeah.
And so I think that already being married could have protected him in a lot of ways, because there's not that intense of a fear that he's going to be dating like white students.
So he graduated in mathematics. Is that right?
It's agricultural economics.
Okay. Agriculture. Then what did he do after he graduated?
Yeah. So he taught for a little time as a public school teacher, but then eventually went on. He studied at Harvard for a little bit, got hired at an HBCU, worked there, went to get his PhD at the University of Missouri, and then went back to New Orleans with his family and helped found a new HBCU called Southern University at New Orleans, and was like a business professor there and, retired there. And yeah.
And you've talked to his children or grandchildren?
Yeah. So I was able to meet with so he had 3 children and only one is still living. And that's Norman Jr. And so I was able to talk to him and then one of his granddaughters as well.
So let's fast forward a couple decades, Grace.
Okay.
BYU had an investigation in recent years that found evidence of fairly common, if not widespread racism on campus of different varieties, kind of some things you described. And that led to the establishment of an Office of Belonging and other reforms that are either have happened or are underway. You're not on campus anymore, of course. So what are your hopes for that?
I want to believe that it's going to do really great things, but it's just very unclear. I think what belonging means. I do think it's helpful that, BYU is a private school, so it can get around some of the new things with the state legislature and everything. But, it's very unclear what that means and what it's supposed to be doing. And so for me, I just feel like there needs to be a very clear mission statement, about fighting racism and about like what it is supposed to do, because belonging, like who do you want to belong? I feel like BYU, I said this at the BYU Slavery Conference, that BYU is at, I feel like, a really important fork in the road where either it can go in the way of, coddling certain groups of people or truly going in a really good direction and being kind of the best of us and like leading the church forward in a way. And so I feel like it kind of needs to choose who does it actually want to belong and who is it going to protect and make feel safe. And that's kind of their decision.
So do you think like a number of people have said, well, for starters, maybe rename the Abraham Smoot Administration Building. Abraham Smoot that was a slaveholder, benefactor of the school. Would that be a wise move in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that definitely shows a commitment to at least like doing something substantial. For me personally, I personally don't feel like it has to be renamed. I feel like having some substantial sort of monument or historicalization of this person would also be helpful. I think of things that are happening at the University of Virginia, right? It's still, they're not getting like removing Thomas Jefferson or things from that, but they are contextualizing it and, pointing out these buildings were built by enslaved people and like having markers everywhere. And so I feel like that is one way that BYU could go without renaming things, but also renaming things would be a really good option. And if that makes people feel more safe and feel more comfortable, then I feel like they should go in that direction.
So last question overall, what conclusions have you drawn from your studies of race at BYU?
It's a very complex history. You have students Black students or Indigenous students and students of any race who will say that BYU is the best time of their lives. And I feel like you have to take those people seriously as well, but also understand what, circumstances may lead them to believe that. Typically, those will be male students. And so I think that is an interesting component. So I do think that those people need to be taken seriously because, those are their true experiences, but also the people who have terrible times and who it's very psychologically, mentally, emotionally, physically damaging need to be taken seriously as well. And I don't understand why, if there's small things that you can do to help people that are seemingly very small things like changing a building name or adding something or creating some sort of an office or event or something, I don't know why you wouldn't do that if it's truly helping people. It seems pretty simple to me.
What would you like our listeners to take away from your research?
That's a very interesting question. I think, finding ways that this is still happening around us. BYU is not perfect still. I mean, the school that I go to right now is not perfect by any means. I'm a University of Utah student, and we talked a little bit earlier about how it has its own past. And so these things are not in the past. They are still very much around us and present, and find ways that we can be better.
Grace Soelberg, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks to Dave Noyes.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.